The French Revolution is usually reduced to two images: an angry mob storming a prison and a guillotine dropping over and over in a public square. Both of those things really happen, but they're just two moments in a decade of upheaval that starts with a financial crisis, topples an absolute monarchy, devours its own leaders, and ends with a young artillery officer crowning himself emperor. It's one of the most consequential 10-year stretches in modern history, and almost none of it goes the way anyone involved actually expects. This is the entire history of the French Revolution. By the late 1780s, France is, on paper, one of the most powerful nations in Europe, but its government is quietly going bankrupt. Decades of expensive wars, including enormous financial support for the American Revolution, have left the crown drowning in debt, and the tax system meant to pay it off is deeply unfair. French society is legally divided into three estates: the clergy, the nobility, and everyone else. And it's the third estate, roughly 97% of the population, that shoulders almost the entire tax burden, while the wealthiest members of the first two estates remain largely exempt. Meanwhile, Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu have spent decades circulating ideas about natural rights, popular sovereignty, and the separation of powers, quietly eroding the intellectual foundations of absolute monarchy even among educated nobles. Bad harvests in 1788 pushed bread prices to crisis levels just as royal finances hit rock bottom, a combination that turns simmering resentment into something closer to desperation. Facing total financial collapse, King Louis XVI does something no French king has done in over a century and a half. He summons the Estates General, a representative assembly of all three estates, to help resolve the crisis. When it convenes in May 1789, an immediate dispute breaks out over voting procedure. The first and second estates want to vote separately by order, guaranteeing they can always outvote the third estate together, while the third estate insists on voting by head, where their much larger numbers would actually matter. Frustrated by the deadlock, the third estate breaks away in June 1789 and declares itself the National Assembly, claiming to represent the true will of the French people. When the king's officials lock them out of their usual meeting hall days later, the delegates gather instead on a nearby tennis court and swear an oath not to disband until France has a written constitution, an act of open defiance against royal authority. Tensions in Paris explode into violence on the 14th of July 1789, when a crowd, fearing the king is massing troops to crush the new National Assembly by force, storms the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison, searching for weapons and gunpowder. The Bastille holds only a handful of prisoners at the time, but its fall becomes an enormously powerful symbol, the collapse of royal tyranny in the eyes of revolutionaries, and the date is still celebrated as France's national holiday today. Word of the uprising spreads into the countryside, sparking a wave of peasant unrest known as the Great Fear, as rumors of aristocratic plots and roving bandits trigger attacks on manor houses and the destruction of feudal records across rural France. The National Assembly responds on the 4th of August 1789 by formally abolishing centuries of feudal privileges in a single dramatic session, and later that month adopts the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a foundational document proclaiming liberty, equality, and popular sovereignty as universal rights, directly inspired by Enlightenment philosophy and the recent American Declaration of Independence. The revolution takes an even more personal turn against the monarchy in October 1789, when a crowd of Parisian women, angry over bread shortages, marches to the royal palace at Versailles and forces the king and his family to relocate to Paris, placing them under the watchful eye of the revolutionary capital, rather than isolated in royal splendor outside it. Over the following 2 years, the National Assembly works to build a genuinely new political system, restructuring French administration, seizing and selling off church lands to help pay off the national debt, and, in 1790, passing the civil constitution of the clergy, which brings the Catholic Church under state control and requires priests to swear loyalty to the nation, a move that deeply divides the country and turns many devout Catholics against the revolution entirely. Louis XVI, increasingly uncomfortable with his diminished authority, makes a fateful decision in June 1791, attempting to flee France in disguise with his family, likely hoping to rally foreign and royalist support to restore his full power. The escape fails when the family is recognized and captured at the town of Varennes, and the humiliating episode shatters what remaining trust ordinary French citizens had in their king, convincing many that he was never truly loyal to the new constitutional order in the first place. Despite this, France adopts its first written constitution later that year, establishing a constitutional monarchy with a new legislative assembly, a fragile compromise that satisfies almost no one and survives less than a year. By early 1792, France is sliding toward war, driven partly by genuine fear that neighboring monarchies will invade to crush the revolution before it spreads, and partly by radical factions within France who actively want to export revolutionary ideals abroad by force. France declares war on Austria in April 1792, and early military defeats only deepen public panic. That panic turns to fury in the summer of 1792, when the Prussian commander leading forces allied with Austria issues the Brunswick Manifesto, threatening to destroy Paris if the royal family is harmed, a threat intended to protect Louis XVI, that instead convinces many French citizens their own king is actively colluding with foreign invaders. On the 10th of August 1792, an armed crowd storms the royal palace at the Tuileries, and the monarchy is effectively overthrown. Days of mob violence follow in early September, as fear of counter-revolutionary prisoners aiding an invading army leads to the brutal September massacres, in which crowds kill over 1,000 prisoners with little pretense of legal process. On the 20th of September 1792, the very same day French revolutionary forces unexpectedly halt a Prussian invasion at the Battle of Valmy. A newly elected National Convention convenes in Paris. The following day, it formally abolishes the monarchy, and on the 22nd, it proclaims the First French Republic. Louis XVI, now simply a citizen, is tried for treason, convicted, and executed by guillotine on the 21st of January 1793. A shocking act that horrifies monarchies across Europe and pushes several more nations into war against France. With war expanding on nearly every border and internal revolts breaking out, including a fierce royalist and Catholic uprising in the Vendée region that's eventually crushed with tremendous bloodshed, the revolutionary government grows increasingly radical and increasingly desperate. Power within the convention shifts toward the more radical Jacobin faction, and in April 1793, a Committee of Public Safety is established to coordinate France's defense against its enemies, both foreign and domestic. Under the growing influence of the lawyer Maximilien Robespierre, the committee begins treating internal dissent as an existential threat, equal to the invading armies at France's borders. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, allows authorities to arrest almost anyone on the vaguest suspicion of disloyalty to the revolution, and revolutionary tribunals begin issuing death sentences at a staggering pace, in what history remembers as the Reign of Terror. Over the roughly 10 months that follow, an estimated 16,000 to 17,000 people are formally executed by guillotine, with tens of thousands more dying in prison or in brutal, extrajudicial killings across the country, particularly during the suppression of the Vendée uprising. The victims include former Queen Marie Antoinette, executed in October 1793, moderate Girondin politicians who had once led the revolution themselves, and eventually even radical revolutionaries who fall out of favor, including Georges Danton, once one of the Terror's chief architects, executed in April 1794 after questioning its increasingly indiscriminate violence. The Terror consumes its own supporters almost as readily as its declared enemies. And by the summer of 1794, fear has spread even into the convention itself, as members begin to suspect Robespierre might turn on any one of them next. That fear finally turns into action. On the 27th of July 1794, a date remembered by the revolutionary calendar as 9 Thermidor, members of the convention move against Robespierre before he can move against them, and he's arrested and executed by guillotine the very next day, along with many of his closest allies. This moment, known as the Thermidorian reaction, effectively ends the Terror, as the new leadership dismantles the Committee of Public Safety's emergency powers and begins a more moderate, if still deeply unstable phase of the revolution. In 1795, France adopts a new constitution establishing the Directory, a 5-member executive council meant to prevent any single leader from ever again seizing the kind of unchecked power Robespierre had wielded. But the Directory proves chronically weak, plagued by corruption, economic hardship, and constant political infighting between royalist sympathizers hoping to restore the monarchy and radical revolutionaries hoping to reignite the terror, forcing the government to rely repeatedly on the army just to survive coup attempts from both directions. It's during this unstable period that a young, ambitious general named Napoleon Bonaparte rises rapidly to national prominence. First, through a series of stunning military victories during the Italian campaign of 1796 and 1797, and later through an ambitious, though ultimately unsuccessful, expedition to Egypt in 1798 and 1799, aimed at disrupting British trade routes to India. By late 1799, with the Directory's authority collapsing and public confidence in the revolutionary government nearly exhausted, Napoleon returns to France and, together with several political allies, executes a coup on the 9th of November 1799, remembered by its revolutionary calendar date as the coup of 18 Brumaire. The Directory is dissolved and replaced with a new government, called the Consulate, with Napoleon installed as first consul, holding power far exceeding that of his fellow consuls in name only. Most historians treat this moment as the effective end of the French Revolution itself, even though Napoleon will go on to crown himself Emperor of the French in 1804, launching an entirely new chapter of European history built directly on the political, legal, and military foundations the revolution had spent the previous decade establishing. The French Revolution's legacy is enormous and deeply contradictory. It permanently ends absolute monarchy in France, though the country cycles through republics, empires, and restored monarchies for decades afterward, before settling into lasting republican government. Its rallying cry of liberty, equality, and fraternity, along with the Declaration of the Rights of Man, helps inspire democratic and nationalist movements across Europe and the wider world for generations to come. It abolishes centuries of feudal privilege and lays groundwork later codified into the Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that still shapes civil law across much of Europe and beyond today. But it also demonstrates, with brutal clarity, how quickly a revolution promising liberty can turn to organized state violence against its own citizens, and how easily the collapse of one entrenched power can open the door to another. 10 years after a financially desperate king summoned an assembly he could no longer control, France emerges an entirely different nation, having tried a constitutional monarchy, a radical republic, a campaign of state terror, and a fragile experiment in collective leadership, before finally handing power to a single ambitious general who would go on to reshape the map of Europe himself.